They say that a person's greatness is not measured by their position, but by their intentions, struggles, and sacrifices. If anyone were to be judged by these standards, Ibrahim Traore would be among those rare individuals who taught the world that true courage doesn't lie in uniforms, but within the heart itself. Ibrahim Traore was born in a small African village that appeared on no maps and held no significance in any government's priorities. Life there meant sun, dust, hunger, and relentless effort. Ibrahim's childhood was ground in the mill of poverty, yet it was also shaped by love, dignity, and sincerity that never diminished despite the hardships. His father was a hard-working blacksmith whose hands were always stained with soot and sweat from the forge. The rhythmic hammering of metal against anvil was the soundtrack of Ibrahim's early years. His mother worked in the fields all day, returning home exhausted each evening, her back bent from labor under the scorching African sun. Their home had rope beds, a leaking roof, and food was often scarce, but love, honor, and devotion were never in short supply. The small dwelling was filled with warmth despite its material poverty. The walls, made of sun-dried mud bricks, bore witness to countless stories of resilience. During the rainy season, they would place pots and pans around the house to catch the water that dripped through the thatched roof. The single room served as kitchen, living room, and bedroom, with a small partition of cloth separating the sleeping area from the rest. Ibrahim's father, Mamadou, was respected throughout the village not for wealth, but for his integrity. Despite his calloused hands and the permanent smell of coal and metal that clung to his clothes, he was a man of principles. He would often tell Ibrahim, "Son, a man's worth is not in what he owns, but in what he gives to others when he has nothing left to give." His mother, Aminata, was a woman of quiet strength. She would wake before dawn to prepare the day's meals with whatever ingredients they could afford, often just millet, a few vegetables, and occasionally a small piece of meat saved from their monthly earnings. Her voice would drift through the early morning air as she hummed traditional songs as she worked, melodies that spoke of hope in times of struggle. From an early age, Ibrahim felt others' pain deeply. When there was no bread in someone's house, he would secretly take his share and leave it there. If someone's child fell ill, he would force his mother to give medicine and deliver it himself. There was a light in his eyes that had been shining since childhood, indicating that this boy was extraordinary. The village children would often play together in the dusty streets, creating games from stones, sticks, and their boundless imagination. But Ibrahim was different. While others played, he would notice the elderly woman struggling with her water jug and would quietly help her carry it home. When younger children cried from hunger, he would share his meager lunch without hesitation. His teachers at the small village school noticed this unusual compassion. Malam Usman, the elderly schoolmaster who taught under a large baobab tree, would often say, "Ibrahim sees with his heart first, then with his eyes. This is the mark of a truly special soul." The school itself was nothing more than a few wooden benches arranged in a semicircle under the shade of the ancient tree. Students wrote on slate boards with chalk, and textbooks were precious commodities shared among many. But Ibrahim absorbed every lesson like dry earth drinks the first rain of the season. Then came the day that changed his life forever. In the village's small marketplace, where vendors sold vegetables, grains, and handmade crafts, sudden screams erupted. A small hut had caught fire, people were shouting, water vessels were being filled, but inside was a trapped 5-year-old child. His mother had fainted from the shock and terror. People were too frightened to approach. The fire was spreading rapidly, consuming the dry thatched roof and wooden supports with terrifying speed. The marketplace, usually filled with the cheerful haggling of vendors and customers, transformed into a scene of chaos. Women clutched their children closer, men shouted instructions that no one could hear over the roar of the flames, and the acrid smoke began to fill the air, making everyone's eyes water and throats burn. The hut belonged to Fatu, a young widow who made her living by weaving baskets and mats. She had been outside hanging laundry when the fire started, possibly from an overturned oil lamp or a spark from the cooking fire. Her son, little Musa, had been napping inside when the flames erupted. At that moment, only 10-year-old Ibrahim made the decision that grown men couldn't make. He jumped into the fire. No one told him to, no one stopped him. Everyone just watched, frozen in disbelief and terror. Some moments later, when the hut's door moved again, there was Ibrahim with the child in his arms. Both their clothes were burned, Ibrahim's hands were completely charred, but there was such determination on his face that seemed to say, when there's a chance to save someone's life, you don't ask questions, you just take action. The rescue took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity to those watching. Ibrahim had wrapped the child in a damp cloth he found inside and shielded him with his own body as they navigated through the smoke and flames. His lungs burned from the smoke, his hands were blistered from grabbing hot surfaces, and his hair was singed, but his focus never wavered from protecting the child in his arms. When they emerged from the burning hut, the crowd erupted in a mixture of relief, amazement, and concern. The child was unconscious from smoke inhalation, but breathing. Ibrahim collapsed to his knees, his strength finally giving out, but he kept checking on little Musa until he was sure the boy would be all right. The villagers rushed him to the small clinic on the outskirts of town. The treatment helped heal his physical wounds, but that incident opened everyone's eyes. Ibrahim had become a hero, but more than that, he had shown a courage that transcended age, size, or circumstance. That very day, an elderly teacher who had retired, Ustaz Musa, stepped forward and announced, "This child carries not just physical wounds, but a magnificent soul. I take complete responsibility for his education." This marked the beginning of Ibrahim's formal learning, though his character had already been forged in the fires of compassion. The burns on Ibrahim's hands healed into scars that would serve as permanent reminders of that day. But rather than being marks of suffering, they became symbols of his willingness to sacrifice for others. Children in the village would sometimes stare at his hands in wonder, and Ibrahim would tell them, "These marks remind me that helping others is worth any pain." Under Ustaz Musa's guidance, Ibrahim flourished academically while never losing his essential character. The old teacher recognized that Ibrahim's gift was not just intellectual, but moral, and he nurtured both aspects carefully. They would spend hours under the baobab tree, not just studying arithmetic and reading, but discussing philosophy, ethics, and the responsibilities that come with strength and knowledge. Power without compassion is tyranny, Ustaz Musa would often say. But compassion without power to act is merely sentiment. You, Ibrahim, must learn to balance both. The lessons extended beyond books. Ustaz Musa taught Ibrahim about the wider world, about different cultures, about conflict and peace, about the role that individuals could play in making the world better. Ibrahim learned French and English alongside his native languages, understanding that communication was a bridge to understanding. As Ibrahim grew into a young man, his combination of intelligence, self-control, and compassion attracted attention beyond the village. When he was 18, he received an offer to join the military academy in the capital. It was an opportunity that could transform his life, but it would mean leaving the village that had shaped him. The night before his departure, the entire village gathered for a farewell celebration. Under the stars, with traditional drums beating and the elderly sharing stories of the past, Ibrahim stood before his community. He spoke quietly, but with conviction. "I may leave this place, but this place will never leave me. Everything I am, Everything I hope to become began here, in the dust and love of this village." His mother, Aminata, had tears in her eyes as she gave him her blessing. "You have always belonged to something larger than our family, larger than our village. Go and serve that calling, but remember where your heart was born." His father, Mamadou, pressed something into Ibrahim's hands, a small piece of metal forged and shaped into a simple cross. "I made this from the same fire where you learned to be brave. Carry it with you, and remember that true strength comes from faith and love." The military academy was a shock to Ibrahim's system. After years in a small village where everyone knew everyone, he found himself among hundreds of young men from across the country, each with their own dreams, fears, and ambitions. The discipline was rigorous, the training intense, and the expectations unforgiving. But Ibrahim adapted quickly. His childhood of rising before dawn to help with chores served him well during early morning drills. His experience with physical hardship made the demanding training manageable. Most importantly, his instinct to help others made him a natural leader among his peers. During the grueling obstacle courses, Ibrahim would often stay behind to help struggling cadets. When others hoarded resources or information to gain competitive advantage, Ibrahim shared what he knew. His instructors noticed this unusual combination of competence and selflessness. Captain Sankara, one of his military instructors, was a veteran with decades of experience. He had seen many young men pass through the academy, some driven by patriotism, others by ambition, still others by desperation. But Ibrahim was different. That young man, he would tell his colleagues, fights not for glory but for principle. That's the kind of soldier who becomes a true leader. The academic portion of his training covered military strategy, international relations, and intelligence gathering. Ibrahim excelled in all areas, but showed particular aptitude for covert operations and intelligence work. He understood that the most effective soldiers were often those who could blend into any environment, gather information without detection, and make critical decisions under pressure. During war games and training exercises, Ibrahim consistently demonstrated the ability to think several moves ahead while never losing sight of the human cost of military actions. When other cadets would propose strategies that were technically sound but ethically questionable, Ibrahim would find alternatives that achieved objectives while minimizing harm to civilians. When his final examination involved a complex scenario where he had to infiltrate a mock terrorist cell and extract crucial information, while other candidates focused solely on completing the mission, Ibrahim also managed to rescue several civilian hostages in the scenario, even though it wasn't required for passing the test. When asked why he had risked complicating his mission for optional objectives, Ibrahim replied, "The real test isn't whether we can complete assignments, but whether we remember why those assignments matter. If we save the day but lose our humanity, what have we really accomplished?" Upon graduation, Ibrahim was commissioned as a lieutenant and assigned to intelligence operations. His ability to blend into civilian populations made him ideal for covert missions where military personnel needed to gather information while maintaining cover as ordinary citizens. His first major assignment took him to the border regions where smuggling operations threatened national security. Working in civilian clothes, Ibrahim spent weeks living among local communities, listening to conversations in markets, observing patterns of movement, and slowly building a network of trusted contacts. What set Ibrahim apart from other intelligence operatives was his genuine care for the people in these communities. Rather than viewing civilians as potential sources of information or obstacles to his mission, he saw them as individuals with their own struggles, hopes, and dignity. This perspective made people naturally trust him, which in turn made his intelligence gathering more effective. During an extended operation, Ibrahim uncovered a human trafficking ring operating under the cover of a legitimate transportation company. The investigation required him to maintain his cover while gathering evidence over several months. The emotional toll of witnessing exploitation while being unable to act immediately was enormous. But Ibrahim understood that hasty action could result in the criminals escaping and continuing their operations elsewhere. When the ring was finally dismantled, 43 victims were rescued and the masterminds were arrested. His careful, patient work had not only solved the immediate case, but provided intelligence that helped authorities dismantle similar operations across the region. His superiors noted in his performance reviews that Ibrahim had an unusual ability to see patterns that others missed, not because he was more intelligent, but because he cared enough to pay attention to details that seemed insignificant to others. A child's fearful reaction to certain adults, unusual patterns in bus schedules, economic disparities that didn't match legitimate business activities. Ibrahim noticed these things because he was genuinely invested in understanding the communities where he worked. After several successful operations, Ibrahim received what seemed like a routine assignment. Intelligence had been received about a suspicious individual traveling from rural areas into the city, possibly connected to an international smuggling group. His orders were straightforward: dress in civilian clothes, travel among the population, and ensure that no one suspected his true purpose. Ibrahim was the kind of person who could be trusted with such delicate work. His superiors knew that he could maintain cover indefinitely while gathering the intelligence they needed. What none of them anticipated was that this mission would become less about national security and more about the fundamental tests that define a person's character. The morning of the mission, Ibrahim prepared with his usual thoroughness. He selected clothes that would help him blend in, well-worn but clean, the kind of outfit worn by someone of modest means traveling for family or business reasons. He carried minimal identification and enough money to travel and eat simply. Most importantly, he carried the small metal cross his father had made for him, now worn smooth from years of being carried in his pocket. As he made his way to the bus station, Ibrahim felt the familiar mixture of alertness and calm that came with beginning a covert operation. He was trained to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing, to remember details while seeming distracted, to be ready for anything while appearing relaxed. The bus station was alive with the typical morning energy. Women in colorful clothing managed children while balancing packages on their heads. Food vendors filled the air with the aroma of fried fish and spiced meat. Conductors shouted destinations and prices while loading passengers into buses that had seen better decades. Ibrahim approached an old blue and yellow bus and purchased his ticket from Musa, the conductor. He found a seat in the back, positioning himself where he could observe other passengers while avoiding drawing attention to himself. The bus was in poor condition, seats that creaked, windows that didn't close properly, and an engine that sounded questionable. But this was typical for public transportation serving rural routes. As Ibrahim settled into his seat and began his surveillance of fellow passengers, he had no idea that his most important mission was not the one described in his official orders, but a test of humanity that would challenge everything he believed about duty, courage, and the meaning of service. Ibrahim's trained eyes swept the bus, cataloging the passengers: farmers with calloused hands and sun-weathered faces, women heading to market with goods to sell, young people traveling to the city with dreams of employment or education. Everything appeared normal until his attention was captured by one particular passenger. An elderly woman, moving slowly with the aid of a walking stick, entered the bus while having a familiar conversation with Musa, the conductor. "My usual seat, Musa, third row by the window," she said in a soft but firm voice. Musa smiled and replied, "Yes, mother, I've kept it clean for you." This was Fatima Wedroga, a blind woman whose face bore the wrinkles of time, but whose inner light was so bright that it startled those who observed her carefully. Ibrahim watched her with the attention he gave to all passengers, but something about her demeanor commanded special notice. She carried herself with dignity despite her disability, and there was a peace in her movements that spoke of someone who had made peace with life's hardships. Fatima settled into her seat with practiced ease. In her right hand she carried a small package wrapped in cloth, perhaps a gift or memento for someone she was visiting. She placed it carefully in her lap and took a deep breath, as if sensing the world around her through means other than sight. Ibrahim found himself thinking, "How strange! I came here to catch a criminal, but a blind woman has captured my attention." There was something about Fatima that drew him in, perhaps the way she navigated her world with such confidence despite her limitation, or maybe the sense of purpose that seemed to emanate from her quiet presence. As the bus pulled away from the station and entered the traffic of the city streets, Ibrahim continued his surveillance of other passengers while remaining aware of Fatima. She sat quietly, occasionally touching the package in her lap with gentle reverence, as if it contained something precious beyond its material value. Without any conversation between them, time passed as the bus moved from the city into the countryside. At each turn, Ibrahim scanned faces and behavior patterns, looking for anything suspicious that might indicate the smuggler he was meant to identify. But increasingly, he found his attention drawn to the elderly woman who seemed to carry herself with such grace despite her blindness. Fatima seemed to sense that someone was watching her. Her heightened senses, developed to compensate for her lost sight, picked up on Ibrahim's attention. She turned her head slightly and said quietly, "God never leaves alone those whom he tests." Ibrahim was startled. She hadn't spoken to anyone in particular, yet her words seemed directed at him. Was it coincidence, or could this blind woman somehow perceive things that others missed? As the bus continued its journey through the countryside, Ibrahim found himself wondering about the woman's story. Fatima Ouedraogo's life had been like a lamp that spreads light even in darkness. She was blind, but her soul remained seeing. She had lost her sight 20 years ago in a fire, but her heart still beat with hope, sacrifice, and love. When the bus reached her familiar seat, it was as if she had entered her own private world. She knew that seat not as a stranger would, but as someone who had traveled this route countless times, who had worn smooth the armrest with her hands and learned every vibration the bus made through that particular spot.
Fatima made this journey every month, always to the same destination, her daughter's village. She always brought a small gift, sometimes sweet treats she had made, sometimes a prayer bead crafted by hand, sometimes just a letter that she couldn't read herself but loved to hear read aloud by her daughter's voice. This time, the package in her lap was different. Wrapped carefully in her best cloth, it felt heavier somehow, more significant. Perhaps it would be her last gift. The thought had been growing in her mind for weeks, a sense that this journey carried special meaning. As she sat by the window, Fatima touched the glass with her fingertips, as if trying to feel the world passing by outside. Trays swayed in the breeze. There was a faint scent of earth in the air, and somewhere in the distance, children were playing. She couldn't see any of it, but her inner world was rich with sensation and memory. 20 years ago, Fatima had also been in a fire. The flames had stolen all the light from her world through her eyes. Her husband had tried to save her, but he had died in that fire while she survived. She lived with her sight gone and the scene burned into her heart. His final moments, his screams, his sacrifice for her. For years, she had carried the guilt that perhaps she had been the cause of his death. After that day, Fatima had stopped thinking of herself as truly alive. She couldn't tell her daughter the full truth about what had happened. Every month, she made this journey carrying gifts, as if each trip were an attempt to lighten the burden she carried in her heart. but today felt different. There was something in the air, something new in the wind, some change that touched her soul. She didn't know that behind her sat a young officer who was silently observing everything, who would soon jump into fire for her just as her husband had done years before. She didn't know that today the life she was living would transform someone else's life. She knew nothing about Ibrahim, and Ibrahim had never spoken a word to her. But in her heart, a prayer had already formed for him, the kind of prayer that is sometimes made without words, the prayer that connects people before fate brings them together. As the bus left the city limits, the landscape changed rapidly. Tall buildings gave way to modest homes, bustling markets were replaced by expansive fields, and the noise and chaos of urban life yielded to the gentle sounds of rural wind and distant voices. The morning's soft light reflected off the dusty roads. Sunlight mixed with the bleating of goats to create a particular kind of rural quiet that made the bus's rattling more noticeable. Inside the bus, passengers gradually became quieter. Some dozed, others gazed out windows. Some looked at phones displaying meaningless images, and others, like Fatima, sat quietly with their memories. Ibrahim's eyes remained in constant motion. Under the cover of this mission, he was supposed to watch for a suspicious individual, but so far no clear target had emerged. However, one thing did give his heart a slight jolt. There was something different about the bus's engine sound, a subtle irregularity that could be felt through the floor with each stroke. Ibrahim pressed his boot heel against the floor. The slight vibration was unusual for a trained officer. He leaned forward slightly from his seat, then sat back and closed his eyes, as if trying to make a decision based on his senses alone. At exactly that moment, Fatima also tapped her walking stick gently on the floor, then felt the surface with her shoe. She remained quiet for a while, as if thinking. Then she spoke softly to the young mother sitting beside her. "Daughter, the earth's breathing has changed. It seems the bus's soul is troubled." The young woman smiled and said, "Mother, everything's fine. The bus is just old, you know. There's a slight vibration. Don't worry." Fatima fell silent, but a line on her forehead indicated she wasn't convinced. Despite being blind, her senses were much sharper than ordinary people. She had felt something strange in the bus's speed, movement, and atmosphere, as if something wasn't right. Ibrahim shifted slightly in his seat and took a long breath. His fingers drummed on his knees. He knew that in such situations, hasty decisions could be harmful, but ignoring signs could also prove dangerous. The bus was now approaching a small village. Outside, women could be seen cooking on clay stoves, children playing, and men working in fields. These scenes held the simplicity of African rural life, but Ibrahim's eyes, searching for something else entirely, couldn't find peace in that simplicity. Suddenly, the bus gave a slight jolt. Ibrahim immediately sat upright. He quickly opened the window and looked towards the bus wheels, but nothing obvious was visible. However, his ears detected something else, a hesitation in the engine's rhythm, a stuttering, as if a heartbeat had skipped for a moment. Ibrahim looked towards the driver, who was operating the vehicle normally, but there was a fine layer of sweat on his face, as if he too was feeling some invisible pressure, but didn't want to show it. The air circulation inside the bus had become somewhat heavy. The air coming through the ventilation carried a slight smell of burning rubber, something that ordinary passengers might ignore, but for Ibrahim, it was a warning bell. As the bus approached a small commercial stop where passengers typically disembarked to drink water, stretch their legs, or buy food and drinks, the atmosphere grew more tense. Local vendors who gathered daily with their carts when buses arrived stood ready, as if holding on to life's rhythm. The bus stopped gently with a slight jolt. At that moment, no one suspected that this jolt was not just from a vehicle stopping, but a signal that fate was about to untie a new knot. Fatima, who didn't usually get off at this stop, remained in her seat. She didn't like moving in crowds, knowing that a blind body becomes lonely in crowds no matter how many people are around.
Suddenly, Ibrahim's voice reached Fatima's ears from near the door, weak, trembling, but peaceful. "Son, I can't see. Where is the path?" This sentence was no less than a bullet for Ibrahim. His heartbeat accelerated. He looked back into the bus, but smoke had obscured everything. For a moment, his inner self-preservation instinct said, "Get out, you've done your duty." But then he remembered that scene when he was 10 years old and jumped into fire. Even then, no one had come to save him. Today, he could become for someone what he had needed at that time. Without wasting time, Ibrahim placed his hand over his mouth and stepped inside. The heat inside the bus was severe. The flames were still confined to the back area, but smoke had spread throughout. Each step seemed to testify that he was walking toward death. "Mother," he called out, "I've come. Don't be afraid. I've come to get you out." Fatima recognized his voice. She said softly, "I'm here, son. I can walk, but show me the way." Ibrahim extended his hand through the smoke. After just a few steps, his hand touched Fatima's shoulder. He firmly grasped Fatima's arm and said, "Hold my hand. I promise I'll get you out." Fatima paused for a moment and said, "Your voice has truth in it. I feel that God has sent you." Ibrahim didn't respond. All his attention was focused on getting Fatima out of the smoke. But the atmosphere inside the bus had become so hot that breathing had become difficult. Smoke had burned their eyes, and flames were now reaching under the seats. Suddenly, Ibrahim felt he had lost the path. Everything was hidden in the haze. The exit doors had disappeared from his sight. It was a moment where people often give up, but he held Fatima's hand firmly and said in his heart, "No, I will take you with me. You're not my duty, you're a test of my faith." Flames had begun to flare inside the bus. One seat had fallen after burning. An iron rod had bent, and sparks were falling from the ceiling. Ibrahim closed his eyes and said to Fatima, "Just one moment, I'm looking for the door. Don't let go of my hand." He crouched on his knees and began feeling for the path with his hands. In the noise of fire, people were screaming outside. "Ibrahim, hurry up, the fire is spreading." But inside were just those two breaths. One elderly, who after a lifetime of patience was at death's door, and one young, who was trading his breaths to save her. Finally, Ibrahim touched the edge of the door. It was hot, burning, but he knew this was the way. "Mother, we've reached, just a little more." Fatima's breathing was getting heavier. Her chest was heaving, and she said while coughing in the smoke, "Son, if I don't make it out, tell my daughter that her mother loved her very much." Ibrahim said firmly, "Nothing like that will happen. Mother, you will live. As long as I'm breathing, I won't let anything happen to you." And he lifted Fatima with his strong arms, moved toward the door, through smoke and fire, for life, for humanity. Smoke had now completely enveloped the bus. Flames were emerging from under the seats and moving toward the inner ceiling. Soot had accumulated on the windows, and the poisonous air coming from ventilation was making every breath a burden. Fatima's breathing was rapid, and sweat was flowing from Ibrahim's forehead as if he were fighting a war, which indeed he was. But the enemy wasn't in front of him. It was a merciless danger spread throughout the atmosphere. "Fire! We have to get out, Mother," Ibrahim said loudly to Fatima. He looked around, but the bus's central door was now engulfed in flames. Going there would be suicide. Then his eye fell on the right side window, the only hope remaining. Ibrahim stood Fatima up and approached the window himself. He struck it hard with his hand, but the glass barely trembled. The glass was thick and had become black with soot. In his second attempt, he struck with his elbow with full force. The glass cracked slightly, as if life itself was searching for a path. In the third attempt, when he broke the window with his elbow despite smoke, heat, and exhaustion, a crack appeared, and as soon as the window broke, fresh air from outside rushed in like a gust. That air was like life's knock. People standing outside shouted, "Is someone inside? We saw a shadow." Ibrahim looked out and called, "There's an elderly lady with me. Get ready to catch her. I'm pushing her through the window." A few men below wrapped their clothes and raised their hands. "We're ready! Send her down!" Fatima was coughing in a semi-conscious state, barely managing to stand. "Mother, just one more task. You have to climb. I'll lift you and you'll go outside. People below will catch you." Fatima said softly, "And you?" Ibrahim paused for a moment and said, "I'll come too, I promise, but you first." Hearing this, Fatima's face showed the same smile that perhaps appears on a mother's face when she becomes certain that her son has truly embraced his upbringing. Ibrahim grabbed her by the waist and with the remaining strength lifted and pushed her toward the window. Feeling the light outside, Fatima took one last breath inside the bus and then crossed the boundary of flames to the outside. The people below caught her firmly, and within moments she was on the ground. Outside there was an uproar. "She's saved! She's saved! The blind mother is saved!" But Fatima's eyes were closed, and there was a question in her heart: where is Ibrahim? Inside the bus, Ibrahim took a moment's breath of relief, but his body's strength was nearly exhausted. His hands were burned, his breathing was heavy with smoke, and his vision was blurring. He was about to exit through the window when his steps faltered and he fell to the floor. Flames inside the bus were now licking the floor. People outside were screaming, "Ibrahim! Ibrahim! Jump!" But he could barely crawl, taking support from walls, dragging himself and trying to get out of the bus. In his ears only Fatima's voice echoed, "Son, show me the path." This sentence was creating courage inside him like a prayer bead. Finally, a shadow emerged from the front door of the bus wrapped in smoke, staggering, burned, but alive. Ibrahim fell down. People ran toward him, poured water, someone gave a sheet, someone placed his head in their lap, and then Fatima, who had been in a semi-conscious state moments ago, suddenly woke up and screamed, "Where's Ibrahim?" When she heard his name, her soul came alive. She took her walking stick and, without eyes, using sounds as support, moved toward Ibrahim, and when her hands touched Ibrahim's face, when she touched his hair and placed her hand on his forehead, it was as if her entire being was crying out, "You turned the fire that stole my sight into faith. Son, you're not just alive, you're light for me." The fire had now completely consumed the bus. Its metal frame twisted into grotesque shapes by the intense heat. Doors and windows were charred beyond recognition, their glass melted into crystalline tears that reflected the orange flames. Thick, acrid smoke rose from the bus roof like a dark prayer ascending to heaven, as if the sky itself was mourning this tragedy. The smell of burning rubber, plastic, and metal hung heavy in the air, creating an apocalyptic scene that would be burned into the memory of every witness. But amidst this destruction, 2 lives had been saved, and in saving them, something much greater had been born. Hope had emerged from despair, courage had conquered fear, and the invisible threads that connect all human beings had been revealed in their full glory. Ibrahim lay on the dusty ground beside the road, his breathing labored but steady. Each breath brought a sharp reminder of the smoke he had inhaled, but his lungs were clearing and strength was slowly returning to his limbs. The burns on his hands and arms were painful reminders of his courage, angry red welts that would heal into scars, adding to the collection he already carried from that day 20 years ago. But his eyes held the same light that had shone since childhood, perhaps even brighter now, illuminated by the knowledge that he had once again chosen love over fear. Around him, villagers had gathered like guardian angels materialized from the dust and heat. Some brought water in whatever containers they could find, plastic bottles, clay pots, even cupped hands. Others offered torn pieces of cloth for bandages, strips ripped from their own clothing without hesitation. Children peered out from behind their parents, wide-eyed at the scene, but somehow understanding that they were witnessing something sacred. An elderly man with weathered hands gently poured cool water over Ibrahim's burns, murmuring prayers in Arabic. A young woman fanned him with a large leaf, trying to provide some relief from the heat that still radiated from the destroyed vehicle. The spontaneous community that had formed around the rescue spoke to something fundamental about human nature, the instinct to care for those who have sacrificed for others. Fatima knelt beside him, her weathered hands gently touching his face, with the tenderness of a mother. Despite her blindness, she seemed to see him more clearly than anyone else present. Her fingers traced the contours of his features as if memorizing them, and in her touch was a recognition that went deeper than sight. "My son," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of gratitude and something else, a knowledge that she had yet not shared. "You have given me more than my life back. You have shown me that angels still walk among us, that the stories of courage I heard as a child were not just fairy tales, but prophecies of what human beings can become."
The local clinic's nurse arrived with basic medical supplies, her small motorcycle kicking up dust as she hurried to the scene. Aisha was known throughout the region for her dedication, often traveling hours to reach patients who had no other access to medical care. As she began treating Ibrahim's burns with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wounds and applying salve, she marveled at his condition. "How did you manage to stay conscious through all that smoke?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "The carbon monoxide levels must have been deadly. Most people would have passed out within minutes." Ibrahim smiled weakly and glanced toward Fatima. "I had someone counting on me. Fear becomes smaller when someone else's need becomes bigger. I couldn't let myself pass out because she needed me to stay awake, to stay strong." "But the heat, the flames," Aisha continued as she wrapped his hands in clean bandages. "These burns should have stopped you from going back into that bus." "Pain is temporary," Ibrahim said quietly, "but the regret of not trying would have lasted forever." Word of the rescue spread quickly through the small village and beyond. By evening, people from neighboring communities had gathered to hear the story. Travelers who had been on other buses stopped to pay their respects. Even government officials from the regional capital made the journey, drawn by reports of extraordinary heroism. But for Ibrahim, the most important conversation was yet to come. He could sense that Fatima had something to tell him, something that went beyond gratitude for the rescue. There was a knowing in her blind eyes, a recognition that suggested their meeting was more than coincidence. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the gathering crowd, Fatima asked to speak with Ibrahim privately. They moved away from the others, finding a quiet spot under an ancient baobab tree, much like the one where Ibrahim had first learned to read all those years ago. The tree's massive trunk and spreading branches seemed to embrace them, creating a sacred space for the revelation that was about to unfold. The evening air was cooling, bringing relief from the heat of the day and the fire. In the distance, the call to prayer echoed from the village mosque, a reminder that even in the midst of tragedy, life continued, faith endured, and hope remained alive. "Ibrahim," Fatima said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years and the tremor of emotion barely contained. "There is something I must tell you, something that perhaps only Allah intended for us to discover today." Ibrahim listened intently, still processing the day's events and wondering about his original mission. The smuggler he was supposed to identify seemed insignificant now, a footnote in a story that had become much larger than military intelligence. His superiors would want a report, but how could he explain that sometimes the mission changes, that sometimes God has different plans than the ones written in official orders?
Fatima reached into her clothing with careful, reverent movements and pulled out the small package she had been carrying. It was wrapped in layers of cloth, protected as if it contained something precious beyond measure. With hands that shook slightly, whether from age, emotion, or the lingering effects of smoke inhalation, she began to unwrap it, revealing a photograph and a letter, both carefully preserved despite their age. 20 years ago, she began, her voice taking on the cadences of a storyteller sharing an ancient tale. When I lost my sight in a fire that consumed half our village, a young boy saved my grandson from the flames. The boy was burned badly in the rescue, his hands scarred by the metal he grabbed, his lungs damaged by the smoke he breathed. But he never gave up, never let go of my grandson, never stopped fighting to bring him to safety. Ibrahim's heart began to beat faster, a recognition stirring in his memory like embers being fanned back to life. The entire village spoke of his courage, how he ran toward danger when everyone else was running away, how he pulled my grandson from a burning hut even though he was just a child himself, how he stayed with us afterwards, helping with the wounded, comforting those who had lost everything. She held out the photograph with trembling hands. This picture was taken that day, after the rescue. The photographer was a journalist who had come to document the fire's aftermath, but he stayed to capture something beautiful, the moment after hell, when hope returned. Ibrahim took the photograph and felt the world tilt on its axis. Even through the soot and bandages in the old image, even across the span of 20 years, he recognized the face. It was his own, 10 years old, holding little Musa after pulling him from the burning hut. He could see his younger self's eyes in the picture, wide with shock but bright with determination. The child he had been stared back at him across 2 decades, a reminder of the moment when his life's purpose had first revealed itself. "You," he whispered, the word barely audible. "I am Musa's grandmother," Fatima said, tears flowing down her cheeks like rivers carving new channels in ancient earth. "For 20 years I have prayed for the boy who saved my grandson. I carried his story in my heart, never knowing his name, never able to thank him properly. I lost my sight that day, but I gained something else, the ability to recognize goodness, to feel the presence of those who carry light within them." The photograph shook in Ibrahim's hands as the full magnitude of the coincidence or divine plan became clear. He remembered that day with perfect clarity now. The screams, the smoke, the weight of little Musa in his arms, the desperate run through flames to reach safety. He remembered the pain of his burns, but more clearly, he remembered the joy on the faces of Musa's family when they were reunited. "Every month for these 20 years, I make this journey to visit my daughter and her son, your little Musa, who is now grown and has children of his own. Every month, I have wondered if somehow, somewhere, I might encounter the boy who changed our lives. I prayed that Allah would give me a chance to say the words that have lived in my heart all these years. Thank you." Ibrahim felt the world spinning around him, not from his injuries, but from the overwhelming realization of how interconnected their lives had been. The mission that brought him to this bus, the intelligence operation he was conducting, none of it mattered compared to this moment of recognition. This was why he was here, not to catch smugglers or gather information, but to complete a circle that had been drawn in fire 20 years ago.
Today, Fatima continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "When I heard your voice in the smoke, when I felt your strength lifting me to safety, my heart recognized what my eyes could never see. The same soul that saved my grandson 20 years ago saved me today. The same hands that pulled him from fire pulled me from death. Allah works in mysterious ways, my son, but His patterns are always perfect." Ibrahim stared at the photograph, remembering not just the rescue but everything that followed, how that day had changed him, how it had set him on a path toward service and sacrifice. He thought of his teacher, Ustaz Musa, who had helped him understand that courage was not about being unafraid, but about acting despite fear. He thought of his parents, who had been so proud when they learned what their son had done. He thought of all the choices he had made since then, all leading to this moment. "The gift I was carrying today," Fatima said, unwrapping the remaining cloth with the care of someone handling a religious relic, "was meant for my daughter, but I think it was always meant for you." Inside was a simple wooden cross, carved with extraordinary care and polished smooth by loving hands. Every line was perfect, every angle precise, yet it carried the unmistakable mark of being made with love rather than professional skill. It was remarkably similar to the metal one his father had given him, the one that still rested in his pocket, but this one carried a different kind of significance. "Musa made this for the boy who saved him," Fatima explained, placing it gently in Ibrahim's scarred hands. "He carved it when he was 15, hoping someday to find you and say thank you. He worked on it for months, learning wood carving just for this purpose. I've carried it for 5 years, waiting for a sign of where to deliver it, praying that Allah would show me the way." Ibrahim took the cross with trembling hands, feeling its weight, not just the physical weight of the wood, but the weight of 20 years of gratitude, of a debt that could never truly be repaid, but could finally be acknowledged. The craftsmanship was beautiful, each detail revealing the care and devotion that had gone into its creation. As night fell over the village like a gentle blanket, Ibrahim and Fatima sat together under the baobab tree, sharing stories that spanned 2 decades. The stars appeared one by one in the clear sky, distant lights bearing witness to their reunion. The medical staff had confirmed that both would recover fully from their ordeal. Ibrahim's burns were painful but not serious, and Fatima's smoke inhalation had been minimal thanks to his quick rescue. The burned bus had been reduced to a skeleton of twisted metal, but from its destruction had emerged something beautiful and profound, the completion of a circle that began 20 years ago with a frightened boy's choice to be brave. "Tell me about Musa," Ibrahim said, his voice filled with wonder of discovery. "How is he now? What did he become?" Fatima's face lit up with grandmother's pride, the kind of joy that comes from watching loved ones grow into their full potential. "He became a teacher, just like the old master who first taught you to read. He says that the day you saved him changed his understanding of what it means to serve others. Before the fire, he was just a child playing and learning. After the fire, he understood that life is precious, that we have responsibilities to each other, that courage is something that can be chosen." Ibrahim thought of his own teacher, Ustaz Musa, and how he had shaped Ibrahim's character after that first rescue. It seemed that day created ripples that extended far beyond what he could have imagined. "It seems that day created more than one teacher," he said quietly. "Musa has taught hundreds of children over the years," Fatima continued, her voice warm with memory. "In every classroom, he tells them the story of the brave boy who showed that real courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. He tells them that heroes aren't people in movies or books, they're ordinary people who make extraordinary choices when the moment demands it."
The old woman shifted slightly, settling more comfortably against the tree trunk. "He married a wonderful woman named Aminata, after your mother, though he didn't know her name when he chose it. He said the name just felt right, like it carried some kind of blessing. She's a nurse, like the one who treated you today. They met at a medical clinic where Musa was visiting sick students." "And they have children?" I asked, though he somehow already knew the answer. "3 beautiful children, 2 girls and a boy. The girls are bright and curious, always asking questions, always wanting to help others. But the boy—" Fatima paused, her smile growing even wider. "He's 10 years old now, exactly the age you were when you saved his father. He has your same restless energy, your same way of looking at the world as if everything is a puzzle to be solved." The symmetry was breathtaking, almost impossible to believe if he weren't living it. "What is his name?" "Ibrahim," Fatima said, with a smile that seemed to illuminate the darkness around them. "They named him Ibrahim, after the unknown hero they prayed for every day. For 10 years they have blessed your name without knowing who you were. For 10 years my great-grandson has carried your name as a reminder that courage is possible, that there are people in the world willing to sacrifice for others." The weight of this revelation settled on Ibrahim like a blessing and a responsibility. Somewhere in the world was a child who carried his name, a living testament to the ripple effects of a single act of courage. His existence was proof that heroism multiplies, that one person's choice to act can inspire others for generations. "I would like to meet them," Ibrahim said quietly, his voice filled with longing and anticipation. "Tomorrow," Fatima promised, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "My daughter's village is only 2 hours from here. When Musa hears what happened today, when he learns that his hero has saved his grandmother, when he discovers that the circle is finally complete, I think his heart might overflow with joy." That night, Ibrahim lay under the stars on a simple mat provided by the villagers, thinking about the strange and wonderful paths that life takes. He had come on this journey as a soldier, following orders, hunting for criminals and threats to national security. His briefing was straightforward: identify suspected smugglers, gather intelligence, report back to headquarters. Instead, he had found something much more valuable: the completion of a story that began with a frightened boy's choice to be brave.
His official mission seemed distant now, almost irrelevant compared to what had transpired. He would have to explain to his superiors why he had abandoned his surveillance, why he had no intelligence to report, why the operation had been compromised. But how could he make them understand that some missions are bigger than the ones written in official orders? How could he explain that sometimes God has different plans, that sometimes the real enemy is indifference, and the real victory is connection? The metal cross his father had made him still rested in his left pocket, while the wooden cross carved by Musa now rested in his right. 2 crosses, 20 years apart, representing the same truth from different perspectives, that love and sacrifice create bonds that transcend time and circumstance. As he drifted toward sleep, Ibrahim felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. The real mission had been this all along: to close a circle of gratitude, to demonstrate that courage is not a one-time action, but a way of being in the world, to show that every act of kindness creates ripples that can span decades and touch lives in ways we never imagine. The next morning brought clear skies and the promise of healing. The sun rose with unusual brilliance, as if nature itself was celebrating the reunion that was about to unfold.
Ibrahim's burns had been properly bandaged by Nurse Aisha, and though his hands would carry new scars alongside the old ones, he felt stronger than ever. The pain was manageable, but the joy in his heart was overwhelming. True to her word, Fatima led him to her daughter's village. The journey was made in a borrowed truck, its blue paint faded by years of sun and dust, driven by Amadou, one of the villagers who had witnessed the rescue. Amadou had insisted on providing transportation, saying it was the least he could do for someone who had risked his life for another. Word of their coming had preceded them, carried by the mysterious network of communication that connects rural communities, a combination of mobile phones, travelers, and the ancient art of storytelling. By the time they arrived at the village, a small crowd had gathered at the entrance, people curious to meet the soldier who had performed such an act of courage. But Ibrahim's attention was immediately captured by a familiar figure standing at the edge of the group, a man in his 30s with kind eyes and a teacher's patient demeanor. He wore simple clothes, a white shirt and dark trousers, but carried himself with the dignity that comes from a life spent in service to others. Even after 20 years, even though he had grown from child to man, Ibrahim recognized something essential in his face, the same intelligence, the same compassion, the same spark of life that he remembered from that terrifying day long ago. "Musa," Ibrahim whispered, the name carrying 20 years of wonder and gratitude. The man stepped forward, his own eyes wide with recognition and disbelief. He had studied the old photograph so many times that he knew every detail of his rescuer's face. Even aged by smoke and soot, now seeing those same eyes in a man's face, understanding that the circle was finally complete, he felt his knees grow weak. "Is it really you?" Musa asked, his voice breaking with emotion. "Is it really you, the boy from the fire, the one who saved my life?" They embraced like brothers reunited after a long war, their arms wrapping around each other with 20 years of unexpressed gratitude and love. Around them, the crowd watched in respectful silence, as two lives that had been forever connected finally came full circle. Even those who didn't know the full story could sense they were witnessing something sacred. "I never stopped looking for you," Musa said, tears streaming down his face. "Every year on the anniversary of the fire, I would pray that somehow I could find you and say the words that have been in my heart for 20 years. Thank you. Thank you for my life, for my future, for everything I have been able to become because you chose to be brave. And I never forgot the weight of you in my arms. That day taught me who I wanted to become. Every choice I've made since then has been shaped by those moments in the fire." As they held each other, both men thought about the paths their lives had taken since that day. Musa had become a teacher, dedicating his life to educating children and telling them stories of courage and kindness. Ibrahim had become a soldier, then a community organizer, always looking for ways to serve others and build bridges between people. Both had been shaped by fire, but instead of being consumed by it, they had been refined by it. Musa's wife Aminata came forward with their 3 children. She was a beautiful woman with intelligent eyes and the gentle manner of someone who spends her life caring for others. Her smile was warm and welcoming, and Ibrahim could see immediately why Musa had chosen her as his partner. The 2 girls, Fatou and Mariam, were shy but curious, hiding behind her mother's skirts while stealing glances at the stranger who had so profoundly affected their family story. They were 8 and 6 years old, with their father's kind eyes and their mother's grace. But the 10-year-old boy stepped forward boldly, his chin raised with the confidence that comes from being raised with love and stories of heroism. He looked so much like his father at that age that he felt he was looking at a ghost or perhaps a promise of the future. "Are you the Ibrahim from Papa's stories?" young Ibrahim asked, with the directness that only children possess. "I suppose I am," Ibrahim said, kneeling to the boy's level so they could look each other in the eyes. "Papa says you're the bravest person in the world. He says that when I grow up, I should try to be like you. He says you taught him that being scared doesn't matter if you do the right thing anyway."
Ibrahim looked into the child's eyes and saw something of himself. The same questioning intelligence, the same spark of compassion, the same restless energy that suggested great things were possible. "Your papa is pretty brave too," he said, "and your great-grandmother is too. Bravery isn't something you're born with. It's something you choose again and again every time you have the chance to help someone else."
"Will you tell me about the fire?" young Ibrahim asked. "Papa says it was very scary, but you saved him anyway." Ibrahim glanced at Musa, who nodded encouragingly. "It was very scary," Ibrahim admitted. "I was terrified. But sometimes being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you're afraid, but you do what needs to be done anyway." That evening, as the extended family gathered for a celebration meal, Ibrahim found himself surrounded by the fruits of a choice made 20 years ago. The feast was simple but joyful: rice and vegetables, fresh bread, tea sweetened with sugar and mint. But the real nourishment came from the stories shared, the connections made, the understanding that they were all part of something larger than themselves. Musa had indeed become a teacher, and over the years he had inspired hundreds of students with stories of courage and service. Many of his former students had gone on to become teachers themselves, doctors, community leaders, carrying forward the lesson that one person's courage can transform entire communities. His wife Aminata ran a small clinic that provided medical care to underserved communities in the region. She had been inspired by the nurses who cared for fire victims 20 years ago, deciding that she wanted to be the kind of person who brought healing in times of crisis. Their children were growing up with values of compassion and service deeply embedded in their understanding of what it meant to be human. Even at their young ages, they understood that they had a responsibility to care for others, that courage was something to be practiced daily in small ways and big ones. But perhaps most importantly, the story of the boy who jumped into fire had become a legend in the region, inspiring other acts of courage, other choices to help rather than flee. Teachers told it in schools, parents shared it with their children, community leaders invoked it when calling for unity and service. The story had taken on a life of its own, multiplying the impact of that single moment of choice. "You know," Musa said, as they sat around the fire after dinner, the stars beginning to appear overhead, "I always wondered if you became a soldier." Ibrahim smiled, thinking about his complicated relationship with military service. "I did. I am. But today I learned that being a soldier isn't just about following orders or fighting enemies. It's about protecting what matters most, not just countries or governments, but the connections between people, the bonds that make us human." He told them about his work in community development, about the programs he had created to build bridges between military and civilian populations. He talked about his vision of a military that served not just by deterring threats, but by strengthening the social fabric that made threats less likely to emerge. "The real enemies," he said, "aren't just the obvious ones, criminals, terrorists, those who would harm others. The real enemies are indifference, isolation, the belief that we don't have responsibilities to each other. Every time someone chooses to help rather than walk away, every time someone risks something for another person's benefit, we win a victory in that larger war." Old Fatima, sitting with her great-grandchildren gathered around her, spoke softly but with the authority of someone who had lived through fire and emerged with wisdom. "When I lost my sight in the fire, I thought Allah had abandoned me. I spent years angry at the darkness, bitter about what had been taken from me. But now I see that sometimes Allah allows us to lose one thing so we can find something more important. She reached out to touch Ibrahim's face again, her fingers tracing the scars that marked him as someone who had chosen courage over safety. I lost my sight, but I gained the ability to see souls. And your soul, Ibrahim, shines brighter than any flame. It has been shining for 20 years, lighting the way for others to follow. That night, as Ibrahim prepared to return to his unit, he knew his life had changed again. His superiors would need to hear about the failed mission, the smuggler who was never found because the mission became something entirely different. There would be questions, perhaps criticism, maybe even disciplinary action. But he also knew that he would request reassignment, not away from service, but toward a different kind of service. He wanted to work full-time in community development, in programs that built bridges between military and civilian populations, in initiatives that created the conditions where children like his younger self could thrive and where courage was cultivated rather than rare. The military needed people who understood that true security came not from weapons or walls, but from communities where people cared enough about each other to take risks for the common good. That was the kind of soldier he wanted to be, the kind of leader his experience had prepared him to become. Captain Sankara, Ibrahim's commanding officer, was a thoughtful man who had risen through the ranks not just through competence, but through wisdom. He had served in various peacekeeping missions and understood that the most important battles were often fought not with weapons, but with ideas, relationships, and the slow work of building trust between communities. He listened in silence as Ibrahim described the events of the past few days, his weathered face showing no emotion as the story unfolded. The official mission had been abandoned when the bus caught fire, but what emerged from Ibrahim's report was something far more valuable than intelligence about smuggling operations. So you're telling me that instead of identifying a criminal, you discovered a 20-year connection to your own past? Yes, sir, and I learned something important about the nature of service. Which is? Ibrahim chose his words carefully, knowing that his future depended on his ability to articulate what he had learned. That our real mission is always to protect and serve people, not just abstract concepts like national security. The threats we're supposed to guard against, smuggling, terrorism, crime, these things hurt people. But so does a society where people don't look out for each other, where courage is rare, where service is seen as someone else's job. Captain Sankara had known Ibrahim for years. He had watched him develop from an enthusiastic but untested recruit into one of his most reliable soldiers. He recognized the depth of thought behind these words, the maturity that comes from genuine experience rather than just training.
"What are you requesting?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Reassignment to community outreach programs. I want to work on building connections between military and civilian populations. I want to help create the kind of communities where people instinctively help each other, where children grow up understanding that they have a responsibility to be brave." Ibrahim paused, then continued with growing conviction. "Sir, we spend enormous resources training soldiers to fight enemies. But what if we could prevent the conditions that create enemies in the first place? What if we could build communities where people are so connected to each other that recruitment by criminal or terrorist groups becomes impossible?" The captain was quiet for a long moment, considering not just Ibrahim's request, but the larger implications of what he was proposing. Then he smiled, the first time Ibrahim had seen him smile during their conversation. "You know, Ibrahim,
Most soldiers want combat assignments. They want excitement, adventure, the chance to prove themselves in dramatic ways. They want medals and stories to tell their grandchildren. I've had my dramatic moments, sir. Now I want to prevent the conditions that make them necessary. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, Captain Sankara replied, opening a folder on his desk. Because I've been looking for someone to head up our new Community Partnership Initiative, someone who understands that the strongest defense of a nation is citizens who care about each other, who know that they have a stake in their community's well-being. The program Captain Sankara described was exactly what Ibrahim had been envisioning, a comprehensive approach to community development that combined traditional military skills with social work, education, and conflict resolution. It would involve working directly with villages and towns to strengthen social bonds, create economic opportunities, and build the kind of resilient communities that could resist both external threats and internal divisions. The position comes with a promotion, the captain added. Lieutenant Ibrahim Traore, Director of Community Partnerships. How does that sound? It sounds like a mission worth dedicating my life to, sir. 6 months later, Ibrahim found himself standing in front of a classroom of young military recruits, but this wasn't a typical military training session. The room was different, too. Instead of rows of desks facing forward, the seats were arranged in a circle, creating an atmosphere of dialogue rather than instruction. Maps on the walls showed not enemy positions, but community assets. Schools, clinics, markets, places where people gathered and connections were made. This was part of the new program he had designed, one that combined traditional military training with community service and character development. The recruits who went through this program would still learn weapons handling, tactics, and military protocol, but they would also learn conflict resolution, community organizing, and the psychology of building trust between groups. "Who can tell me what courage is?" he asked the class of 20 young men and women, all eager to prove themselves worthy of military service. A young recruit named Omar raised his hand enthusiastically. He was 18 years old, fresh from his village and burning with the desire to make his mark on the world. "Facing the enemy without fear, sir." "That's one definition," Ibrahim said, walking to the blackboard. "But I want to tell you about a different kind of courage." He wrote 2 dates on the board, one from 20 years ago, one from 6 months ago. "On these 2 days, I jumped into fires. The first time, I was 10 years old and terrified. The second time, I was a trained soldier and still terrified. But I learned something important. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and choosing to act anyway." The room fell silent as he began to tell them about Musa, about Fatima, and the circle that connected a boy's choice to a man's destiny. He talked about fear, not as something to be ashamed of, but as information to be processed and overcome. He talked about the weight of responsibility, the joy of service, the way courage multiplies when it's shared. "Every act of courage creates ripples," he said, returning to stand in the center of the circle. "You might save one person, but that person might go on to save hundreds more, as a teacher, a doctor, a parent who raises children to be brave. You might build trust with one community, but that trust might spread to neighboring communities, creating networks of cooperation that prevent conflicts before they start." The recruits listened with the intensity that comes when someone speaks from personal experience rather than textbooks. They could see the scars on his hands, the quiet confidence in his manner, the authenticity that comes from having lived the lessons he was teaching. "Your mission," Ibrahim continued, "is not just to be soldiers, it's to be the kind of people that others can count on, in uniform and out of it. The kind of people that make communities stronger just by being in them. The kind of people who understand that true security comes not from weapons or walls, but from relationships and trust. After class, a young recruit named Aisha approached him. She was one of the few women in the program, determined to prove that she belonged. "Sir, I grew up in a village where everyone knew the story of a boy who saved someone from a fire. Was that you?" Ibrahim smiled, thinking about how far the story had traveled, how many lives it had touched without his knowledge. Stories have a way of traveling, don't they? But the important thing isn't who the hero was. The important thing is that the story made you want to be someone who helps others. "It did," she said firmly. "Every time I heard that story, I thought about what I would do in that situation. I made myself a promise that if I ever had the chance to help someone, I wouldn't hesitate." "Then the story has already succeeded," Ibrahim told her. "The real power of courage isn't in the original act, it's in all the acts it inspires afterward." 1 year after the bus fire, Ibrahim received an invitation that brought tears to his eyes. Young Ibrahim, Musa's son, was graduating from primary school, and they wanted his namesake to be there for the ceremony. The invitation was written in a child's careful handwriting, decorated with drawings of stars and crosses. The school was much like the one where Ibrahim had first learned to read. Simple wooden benches arranged under the shade of ancient trees, children in clean but worn uniforms, teachers whose love for their students was evident in every interaction. But there were improvements too. New textbooks, a small library, even a computer donated by a development organization. Progress was slow but steady. Young Ibrahim was giving a speech as the top student in his class, standing at a makeshift podium made from wooden crates. His topic, Heroes in Everyday Life. As he spoke, his voice carried the confidence of a child who had been raised to believe that his voice mattered, that his words could make a difference. "My grandmother is blind," the boy said, his clear voice carrying across the assembled crowd of families and teachers, "but she sees more than most people with perfect eyes. She taught me that heroes aren't people in movies or books, they're people who choose to help others even when it's scary or difficult." Ibrahim listened, amazed at the poise and wisdom of his young namesake. The boy spoke about different kinds of heroism: the teacher who stayed late to help struggling students, the farmer who shared his harvest with hungry neighbors, the mother who worked multiple jobs to send her children to school. "But I want to tell you about a different kind of hero," young Ibrahim continued, his eyes finding the adult Ibrahim in the crowd. 20 years ago, there was a fire in my great-grandmother's village. A boy who is the same age as me ran into the burning building to save my father. He didn't know my father's name. He didn't know if anyone would thank him. He just knew that someone needed help." The crowd turned to look at Ibrahim, recognizing him from the stories that had spread throughout the region. He felt the weight of their attention, but more importantly, he felt the weight of responsibility, to live up to the story, to continue being worthy of the trust placed in him. "The soldier didn't save my great-grandmother on the bus because it was his job. He saved her because it was right. And that's what heroes do. They do what's right, even when no one is watching, even when it's dangerous, even when they're afraid." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Ibrahim barely heard it. He was thinking about the circle that had brought them all together, about the mysterious ways that courage multiplies across time and space, about the profound responsibility that comes with being someone's inspiration. After the ceremony, Ibrahim spent time with the family that had become his second family. The celebration was held in Musa and Aminata's compound, a collection of simple buildings arranged around a central courtyard where children played and adults shared stories under the evening stars. Musa was now just a teacher, but the headmaster of the expanded school, having overseen its growth from a single classroom under a tree to a proper building with 6 classrooms and over 200 students. His reputation had spread throughout the region, and parents would travel for hours to enroll their children in his school, knowing that they would receive not just education but formation of character. Aminata had transformed her small clinic into a regional health center that served 3 villages and provided training for community health workers. She had also started a program for women's literacy, understanding that education was the foundation of all other development. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in Fatima herself. At 82, she had become a beloved storyteller whose tales of courage and kindness were known throughout the region. Children would gather around her in the evenings to hear stories that weren't just entertainment, but moral education, lessons about the kind of people they could choose to become. "You know," Fatima said as they sat together watching the children play, the same words she had spoken a year ago, but with deeper meaning now. "I used to think my life was divided into 2 parts, before the fire that took my sight and after, but now I see it differently. My life is one continuous story about learning to see what really matters." "And what's that?" Ibrahim asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "That we're all connected in ways we can't always see. That every choice we make touches other lives in ways we might never know. That the light we bring to others' darkness comes back to illuminate our own path." She paused, her blind eyes seeming to look directly into his soul. "And that God uses broken people to save other broken people because we understand what it means to need saving." As the sun set over the village, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ibrahim reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had started as a boy who jumped into fire out of instinct, become a soldier who followed orders, and evolved into a teacher who understood that the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with choices to care for one another. His hand still bore the scars from both fires, the first when he was 10, the second when he was 30. But now he saw those scars not as marks of suffering, but as evidence of a life lived with purpose, as reminders that beauty comes through pain, that strength is forged in fire. The little cross his father had made him still rested in his pocket, alongside the wooden one carved by Musa. 2 crosses, 20 years apart, representing the same truth from different perspectives, that love and courage are the forces that truly shape the world, that sacrifice for others creates bonds stronger than blood, and that every act of kindness is a victory against the darkness. 3 years after the bus fire, Ibrahim received a report that would change his understanding of his work's impact. It came from Dr. Sarah Mensah, a researcher from the University of Accra, who had been studying community resilience in rural areas. She had heard about the Community Partnership Initiative and wanted to document its effects.
"Lieutenant Traore," she said during their meeting in his office, "I've been tracking social indicators in the communities where your program operates. The results are remarkable." She spread charts and graphs across his desk, showing decreases in crime, increases in school enrollment, improvements in health outcomes, and most importantly, changes in what she called social cohesion, the degree to which community members felt connected to and responsible for each other. "But what's most interesting," Dr. Mensah continued, "is how the effects spread beyond the communities where you work directly. It's as if courage and cooperation are contagious, spreading from village to village through networks of family and friendship." Ibrahim studied the data, amazed to see quantified what he had hoped was happening.
Communities that had never directly participated in his programs were showing similar improvements, apparently influenced by the example of their neighbors. "There's something else," Dr. Menses said, pulling out a thick folder. "I've been collecting stories, accounts of individual acts of courage and community service that people attribute to hearing stories about your work. Would you like to hear some of them?" Over the next hour, Ibrahim listened to accounts that left him speechless. A teacher in a distant village who had started a literacy program for adults after hearing the story of young Ibrahim's graduation speech. A group of farmers who had organized a collective to help families affected by drought, inspired by tales of communities working together. A teenage girl who had rescued 3 children from a flooding river, later saying she had thought about the soldier who runs toward danger instead of away from it. The most remarkable case, Dr. Mensa said, involves a former child soldier who heard your story while in a rehabilitation program. He's now training to become a teacher himself, saying that if someone who had been through fire could choose to serve others, then he could choose a different path than the violence he had known. Ibrahim felt overwhelmed by the weight of these stories, by the realization that the ripples from that day on the bus had spread far beyond anything he could have imagined. Each story represented not just one person's choice to be brave, but potentially hundreds or thousands of future choices by those they would influence. 5 years after the bus fire, Ibrahim stood before the graduating class of the first group of young people to complete the full community partnership program. These weren't just soldiers, they were community builders, conflict mediators, development workers who understood that true security came from strong communities rather than strong weapons. Among the graduates was Omar, the young recruit who had defined courage as facing the enemy without fear. Now 23, he had spent 2 years working in rural communities, helping to establish youth programs, mediating disputes, and building bridges between different ethnic groups. His definition of courage had evolved considerably. "Courage," he said in his graduation speech, "is getting up every day and choosing to serve others even when the work is slow and the progress is hard to see. It's believing that small actions of kindness can change the world even when the world seems determined to prove you wrong." Also graduating was Aisha, the young woman who had grown up hearing stories of the boy who jumped into fire. She had specialized in women's education and economic empowerment, working with rural women to start small businesses and literacy programs. Her final project had been establishing a network of women's cooperatives across 3 regions, creating economic opportunities while building social bonds. "What I learned," she said, "is that heroism isn't about individual achievement. It's about creating conditions where everyone can be heroic, where courage becomes normal instead of exceptional." The graduation ceremony was held in the original village where Ibrahim had rescued Fatima, under the same baobab tree where they had first shared their stories. Representatives from dozens of communities came to witness the event, many bringing gifts and stories of how the graduates had impacted their lives. Young Ibrahim, now 15 and already showing signs of following his father into teaching, served as the master of ceremonies. He had grown into a confident young man with his namesake's compassion and his father's wisdom, already emerging as a leader among his peers. 5 years ago, he said, addressing the crowd, a bus caught fire on this road. 2 people were saved that day, but the real rescue was of something bigger, the idea that we all have a responsibility to take care of each other, that courage is something we can choose, that heroes are made, not born. 10 years after the bus fire, the Community Partnership Initiative had become a model studied and replicated across West Africa and beyond. Delegations came from other countries to learn how communities could be strengthened from within, how military forces could serve as community builders rather than just guardians. The program's motto, inscribed over the entrance to the training center, was simple but profound. Courage is contagious. Below it, in smaller letters, was the expanded version that had emerged from years of experience. Every act of courage inspires others. Every person served becomes a server. Every community strengthened makes the whole region more secure. But perhaps the most important legacy was harder to measure in statistics or reports. It lived in the countless small choices made by people who heard the story of the boy who jumped into fire, who understood that heroism wasn't about being perfect or fearless, but about being present when others needed help. The story had evolved over the years, becoming less about Ibrahim's actions and more about the principle that courage is a choice available to everyone. Teachers told it in classrooms, parents shared it with their children, community leaders invoked it when calling for unity and service. Each telling was slightly different, adapted to local contexts and needs, but the core message remained the same. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to put others' needs above their own comfort. Young Ibrahim, now 20 and a student teacher himself, had become the primary keeper of the original story, but he had learned from his namesake the importance of focusing not on individual heroism, but on collective possibility.
"The soldier didn't save my great-grandmother because he was special," he would tell his students, using words very similar to those Ibrahim had spoken years earlier. He saved her because he chose to be, and that choice is available to all of us, every day, in big ways and small ones. Fatima, now in her late 80s, had become something of a philosopher, her blindness having given her a unique perspective on the nature of sight and insight. Despite her age, she continued to make her monthly journeys to visit family, though now she traveled in the comfort of vehicles provided by the many communities that honored her as a living treasure. Her stories had become legendary throughout the region, but her favorite remained the story of the two fires, the one that took her sight and the one that restored her faith in human goodness. She would tell it differently each time, emphasizing different lessons depending on her audience, but always ending with the same truth, that light exists in every person, waiting to be kindled by courage and compassion. "People ask me," she would say, settling into her role as storyteller with the ease of long practice, "if I regret losing my sight. They think blindness is darkness, that I live in a world without light. But I tell them they are wrong. Since I lost my sight, I have seen more light than ever before, the light in people's souls when they choose to help others, the light that connects all living things, the light that proves we are never truly alone." Her great-grandson, young Ibrahim, would often accompany her on these journeys, serving as her eyes while learning from her wisdom. At 20, he had developed into a remarkable young man, combining his father's dedication to education with his great-grandmother's storytelling gifts and his namesake's commitment to service. "Habibti," she would say to him, using the Arabic term of endearment, "never forget that the story is not about the hero. The story is about the choice that anyone can make to be heroic. The moment you make it about special people doing special things, you take away other people's power to see themselves as capable of courage." 15 years after the bus fire, Ibrahim received an invitation that would complete the circle in ways he never could have imagined. The invitation came from young Ibrahim, now 25,
and the headmaster of a new school he had established in a remote region that had been plagued by conflict and poverty. "Dear Uncle Ibrahim," the letter read. The title of respect had evolved naturally over the years. "I am writing to invite you to the dedication of our new school. But more than that, I want you to meet someone who has asked specifically about you, a boy whose story might sound familiar." The school was located in a region that had been torn by ethnic conflict for decades, where children had grown up knowing more about division than unity, more about survival than service. Young Ibrahim had gone there fresh from his teacher training, determined to plant seeds of hope in soil that had been watered with too much blood and tears. The dedication ceremony was a celebration not just of a new building, but of a community's commitment to choose education over ignorance, cooperation over conflict, hope over despair. Representatives from surrounding villages came, many of them former enemies who had learned to work together through young Ibrahim's patient mediation. But it was during the private conversation afterward that the true significance of the invitation became clear. Young Ibrahim led his namesake to a quiet corner where a boy of about 10 sat reading under a tree, the same position where Ibrahim had first learned to love books all those years ago. "This is Amadou," young Ibrahim said gently. "Tell Uncle Ibrahim about what happened last month." The boy looked up with eyes that held pain but also determination, the same combination Ibrahim recognized from his own childhood. "There was a fire in our village," Amadou said quietly, "a building where some families were staying. Everyone was running away because the flames were so big and scary." Ibrahim felt his heart begin to race, sensing where this story was heading. "But there was a little girl inside crying for help. She was only 5 years old and couldn't find her way out through the smoke." Amadou's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I was scared too, but I remembered the story Teacher Ibrahim tells us about the boy who jumped into fire to save someone. I thought about how that boy chose to be brave even though he was frightened." "And what did you do?" Ibrahim asked, though he already knew the answer. "I ran into the fire and found her. I carried her out to safety, even though my hands got burned." Amadou held up his small hands, showing fresh scars that would mark him for life, just as Ibrahim's had marked him. The circle was complete, but it was also beginning again. Another frightened boy had made the choice to run toward danger instead of away from it, inspired by a story that had traveled across decades and hundreds of miles. Another life had been saved. Another hero had been born. Another chapter in the endless story of human courage had been written. Ibrahim knelt down to Amadou's level, looking into eyes that reflected his own journey from fear to courage, from childhood trauma to adult purpose. "Tell me about the little girl. What happened to her?" "She's safe," Amadou said with a smile. "Her name is Fatima, like the old lady in the story. Her parents want to thank me, but I told them that I was just doing what the story taught me, that we all have to take care of each other." Another Fatima, another rescue, another link in the chain of courage that stretched back through time and forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. Ibrahim felt tears coming to his eyes as he realized that the story would never truly end. It would just keep expanding, touching new lives, inspiring new choices, creating new possibilities for human goodness. 20 years after the bus fire, Ibrahim stood before a gathering unlike any he had ever addressed. Representatives from dozens of countries had come to hear about the Community Partnership Initiative, which had become a model for community-based security programs around the world. But more than that, they had come to understand how individual acts of courage could create waves of change that transformed entire regions. The conference was being held in the same village where it all began, in a new community center built on the site where the bus had burned.
The building itself was a symbol of transformation, rising from the ashes of destruction created through the cooperation of communities that had once been strangers, funded by organizations that recognized the power of grassroots change. 20 years ago, Ibrahim began, his voice carrying the authority of experience and the humility of someone who had learned that true heroism is always collective. A bus caught fire on the road outside this village. In the immediate sense, 2 lives were saved that day. But in a deeper sense, something much more important was rescued: our faith in each other, our belief that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, our understanding that courage is not a rare gift, but a common choice. He looked out at the audience: government officials, military leaders, community organizers, teachers, students, and survivors of various conflicts and disasters. Among them sat Fatima, now 92 but still sharp and engaged, still the keeper of stories that had shaped a generation. Beside her sat the extended family that had grown around their shared experience: Musa and Aminata, their children, now adults with children of their own, and representatives of the hundreds of communities that had been touched by their story. "The lesson I want to share with you today," Ibrahim continued, his voice carrying the authority of experience and the humility of someone who had learned that true heroism is always collective, "is not about individual heroism. It's about something much more powerful. The way courage multiplies when it's shared, the way one person's choice to serve others creates ripples that can transform entire societies." He told them about Amadou, now 20 and a teacher himself, who had established schools in 3 conflict-affected regions. He spoke about the young woman named Aisha, who had become a doctor, inspired by stories of service to dedicate her life to providing healthcare in underserved communities. He talked about the former child soldiers who had become peace mediators, the ex-criminals who had become community leaders, the thousands of young people who had chosen service over self-interest because they heard stories that made such choices seem not just possible, but necessary. "But perhaps the most important thing I've learned," Ibrahim said, his voice growing softer but somehow more powerful, "is that we are all connected in ways we rarely stop to consider. Every choice we make sends ripples through time and space, touching lives we will never know about, creating possibilities we could never imagine. The boy I saved 20 years ago became a teacher who has educated hundreds of children. One of those children rescued another child from fire. That rescued child will grow up to make her own choices about service and courage, creating new ripples that will spread in directions we cannot predict." The audience listened in respectful silence, understanding that they were hearing not just a speech, but a testimony, not just a story, but a way of understanding the profound interconnectedness of human experience. The light in the darkness is not about any one person or any one moment of courage. It's about all of us, each carrying our own flame, each contributing to an endless network of hope and possibility. Every time we choose compassion over indifference, service over selfishness, courage over comfort, we add our light to the great constellation of human goodness that has been shining since the beginning of time and will continue to shine long after we are gone. As applause filled the community center, Ibrahim felt the presence of all those who had shaped his journey. His parents, who had taught him that love requires sacrifice. His teacher, who had shown him that knowledge must be shared to have meaning. Fatima, who had demonstrated that wisdom can emerge from suffering. Musa, who had proven that rescue creates bonds stronger than blood. And the countless unnamed individuals who had chosen courage in small moments and large ones, creating the web of connection that made all their lives possible. The metal cross his father had made still rested in his left pocket, the wooden cross carved by Musa in his right. But now he understood that these were not just personal talismans, but symbols of something universal. The way love crosses time and distance. The way sacrifice creates bonds that death cannot break. The way each generation passes its values to the next,
through stories and examples rather than just words. Outside the community center, children played under the same trees where Ibrahim had first learned to read, where Fatima had first shared her wisdom, where young Ibrahim had given his graduation speech all those years ago. They played games of rescue and heroism, acting out stories they had heard from their parents and grandparents, unconsciously preparing themselves for the moments when they too would be called to choose between safety and service. The light in the darkness was eternal, passed from one generation to the next like a sacred flame that could never be extinguished. It burned in every person who refused to look away from suffering, in every community that chose cooperation over conflict, in every child who dreamed of growing up to help others. And in a small village in West Africa, where ancient trees provided shade for new dreams and old wisdom guided young courage, the light continued to shine as bright and steady as ever, a beacon of hope in a world that would always need heroes, and a reminder that heroism is not about being perfect or fearless, but about being present when others need us most. The story of Ibrahim Traore was complete, but the story of human courage would continue forever, written daily in the choices of ordinary people who understood that they had the power to be someone else's light in the darkness.